everybody, and welcome to the January 2024 Public Forum topic analysis video by Champion Briefs. My name is Thadeus Smith. I'm an assistant coach at the American Heritage School in Broward County, Florida, and I'm also a staff writer for Champion Briefs, specifically Public Forum. So I'm excited to make this analysis for you. It's on the January 2024 Public Forum topic, which is resolved the United States federal government should repeal Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. And there's three things I want to note about this topic before we get into the background and the argument analysis. The first is that this topic represents a shift for the public forum community because we're moving from 2-month topics where we've had an incredible amount of time to plan and research. We're moving away from that to our 1-month topics. So that research timeline you've gotten used to is going to have to be vastly accelerated in order to produce the same kind of quality arguments. Second, this topic was vastly preferred in the public vote. It received a plurality of the student vote and the coach vote. That's not necessarily indicative of quality, but it is worth noting that people very clearly thought this was a superior topic. And then the last note is, much like student loans, our previous topic, a lot of people are going to have heard something about Section 230, and a surprising number of people are going to already have an opinion on it. Unfortunately, they're going to have heard about Section 230 in a context that is rife with misinformation, politically motivated arguments, and that means that as debaters, you're going to have to contend with a higher than normal amount of judge bias when it comes to the judge pool on this topic. That's not necessarily a problem. It just means that you're going to have to clearly explain what Section 230 does and clearly explain the benefits or detriments of it, depending on what side you're on. With those kind of explanatory notes out of the way, let's get into the background. This topic is very straightforward. The United States federal government, obviously, is the federal government of the United States, and then it says should repeal. So the affirmative isn't going to be talking about an alternative. They're not going to have any real advocacy. We're just erasing this law from the books, making it as though it never happened. So the only thing we actually have to define then is Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. Section 230 is a part of the US law that essentially says a social media company or any company that allows user-generated content, a website, cannot be held liable for things users post. And so let's do some historical background on how this came to be. Historically, if something was being published in the public sphere, the public square, the person publishing that information and distributing it was going to be held liable for what it said. And that's because historically, the only place to really disseminate information to everybody was a newspaper. And newspapers have editorial policies where they have reviewed and they have made a pledge to fact check the things they publish. So the understanding was if a newspaper publishes something that is incorrect, then the newspaper can be held liable for that falsehood. The only way somebody could really disseminate information outside of that was through a bulletin board. But if it's just a bulletin board in the town square, that's easy to manage, right? Anybody can come in and rip down a poster they think is offensive, and it has a very limited reach. When the internet blew up, really the early 1990s, for the first time ever, people had the ability to share information with a wide range of people. Their reach went from maybe 10 or 15 people to hundreds of thousands on these early web forums and bulletin boards. And for a while, nobody really knew what to make of this. And it wasn't clear legally whether a website that allowed people to make posts was a publisher because it published those information online, or if it was a platform, if it just allowed a space for other people to publish things. And so the courts could not agree. You have cases from the 90s that said, obviously a website is a publisher, obviously a website can be held liable, and you have cases from the 90s that said, no, of course not, it's the user that's liable. And in 1996, Congress fixed this by enacting the Communications Decency Act. The only relevant part of this is Section 230, which is the part we're debating. What Section 230 says is no provider or user of an interactive computer service shall be treated as the publisher or speaker of any information provided by another information content provider. What that means is that an online platform cannot be treated like a publisher in US law. That means that it can't be held liable for the things that people post. The effect of this cannot be understated. Because of Section 230, there was an explosion in the amount of user-generated content on the internet. Platforms like Facebook, YouTube, Reddit, even Wikipedia could not exist without Section 230. They were allowed to grow exponentially because they didn't have to worry about manually reviewing every post. They didn't have to worry about being sued into oblivion the first time something went wrong. And so without that protection that Section 230 offered, it's likely that we would not have a lot of these user-generated content websites today. Important clarification here is that user-generated content doesn't just mean social media, right? Obviously, that's the most prominent example, like a place where you just post things. But it can also apply to a website like Wikipedia or fandom wikis, right, that allow people to write articles. It can apply to the New York Times website comment section, where people are allowed to make comments. And so this is much more expansive than just social media websites. For a long time, probably 15, 20 years, Section 230 was just generally accepted as correct and good, but in recent years, it's come under fire. There's two ways that it's come under fire. The first is through instances of violence where people have said somebody was inspired to do a violent action by social media, or they planned it on social media, or they were recruited for it on social media. And there have been lawsuits filed against companies like Twitter and Google saying, hey, you've aided and abetted this violence. The courts have not really made a determination about how Section 230 might relate to that. But that's a core piece of criticism that this law has gotten. Second piece of criticism, and this is that kind of politically motivated argument I mentioned earlier that a lot of judges will be familiar with, has to do with neutrality online. This is best illustrated by when Twitter banned Donald Trump right after the January 6th attacks. They said that he had violated their content policies on like promoting violence, on hate speech, whole range of other things. And the immediate reaction to that ban from a lot of American conservatives was to say, Twitter is the public square. Twitter is a place where people, like, that's how people communicate. And if this company is able to just remove people arbitrarily, that's unneutral. That Twitter had done essentially editorial activity. And because of that, that it was unneutral, Section 230 should be repealed, Twitter should be sued. We'll get into like the merits of that argument in a minute. But I think that's all the background you need. Section 230 just says a website cannot be held responsible for something a user does or posts. So let's get into what those affirmative and negative arguments are going to be. I think that a lot of the arguments on the affirmative on this topic are going to be very similar in terms of like the link chain. It's just the impact scenario that's going to differ. So a core AF argument is that Section 230, there's no incentive to moderate. So if we repeal Section 230, companies will have to start moderating much more heavily because they could be held liable if they don't moderate. And at that point, if the app is able to show that, it's really pick and choose your impact. A few of the impacts I think will be pretty common here are terrorism. Terrorist organizations like ISIS, ISIL, Al-Qaeda, they all have a history of promoting themselves and recruiting on social media. And if we were to repeal Section 230, maybe we're able to preemptively like stop terrorist attacks because we're able to prevent these terrorists from recruiting. We're able to sue companies that platform them. A second big impact out of this is going to be like white supremacism in the United States. Obviously, white supremacists are often radicalized on social media. That's where they spread their messages. And so if we're able to stop companies that are platforming these white supremacists, we see that decline, and that can be impacted out to things like the epidemic of mass shootings in the United States. Another common impact that I think will be pulled out of this is the idea that social media companies somehow benefit from human trafficking or sex trafficking. By allowing posts both from people who are engaged in prostitution and from people who are actively trafficking other people. And so repealing Section 230 would plainly and clearly allow us to hold those people and those companies accountable. And I think a fourth impact scenario that we might get out of this incentive to moderate is illegal drugs. Social media platforms might facilitate the sale of illegal drugs. And so repealing Section 230 allows us to clearly hold these companies accountable for platforming this speech. Central to that affirmative advocacy is going to be proving that platforming the speech is just as bad as making the speech. But I think that that will be relatively easy for the affirmative to do because, of course, if you platform something, you give it a much wider reach than it would otherwise have. I think a second affirmative advocacy here, or affirmative argument here, is going to circle around the possibility of a threat to democracy. The link chain here is pretty similar. Incentive to moderate, companies will be more proactive, but we're going to be a lot more specific on a democracy argument with what our impact scenario is. And I think there's two ways that that can go. The first is this idea of okay, let's look at the January 6th attacks. Or as a lot of people have described this January 6th attack on the US Capitol as an insurrection, right? Those attacks were primarily planned on social media. And I think there's room for a lot of great rhetoric from the AF here about the threat that those attackers posed. There's a lot of evidence that if these attacks had happened, 30 seconds later, 30 seconds earlier, that politicians would have been caught by the attackers, that people had come in with the intent of killing. People had come in with handcuffs, with guns, shouting politicians' names, and that social media essentially almost allowed for a coup. I think a second way we can spin a democracy point on the affirmative, though, is this idea of political disinformation, specifically foreign interference. If we look at Russian interference in the 2016 election, a lot of people with a very basic understanding think that that Russian interference was in the form of switching votes. It was in the form of hacking election systems and trying to change things. And really, that's not what happened, right? The interference was primarily on social media. Russian troll farms created accounts representing extremes on both sides of the aisle. They heightened tensions. And because companies didn't have clear policies about this, they were able to get away with that and make the political discourse a lot more heated and a lot more murky than it otherwise might have been. This is especially potent for January 2024 because it's going to be the first topic of the year that we're actually in an election year for. And I think that there's room for a lot of impacting here about the threat that foreign interference poses to maybe a Biden victory. If you can impact out and say repealing Section 230 is key to supporting a Biden victory, Biden re-entering the White House, that's probably going to be a pretty strong impact scenario. So let's move on to possible negative arguments. And I think that there's going to be more variety on the negative in terms of what you can make, at least more varied link chains. But the first one's going to go back to this idea of moderation. I think that the negative can say that if companies are going to be held liable for anything a user posts or says, that they're going to moderate in a much more heavy-handed way than they otherwise might, right? If a company can be held liable, if they think that they're going to be sued, then they're probably going to take a much more extreme and radical approach to moderation than they otherwise would. And that could amount to censorship. It could amount to the censoring of minority voices or voices that are outside of the mainstream. And there are a lot of ways that that might be bad, right? when you think about the nature of what does and doesn't constitute a controversial opinion, it's really subjective. There are a lot of opinions that we think are controversial now that, or that we don't think are controversial now, that would have been considered controversial 30 years ago. I think a really obvious example here is like the social acceptance of gay marriage and how much that's changed over time. We can apply that to any like social opinion. And that heavy-handed moderation could also like lend itself to the censorship of like reporting on real-time events. I think there's an argument to be made that the power of being to speak out against the powerful on social media is really important. If you look at the Me Too movement and you had people speaking out on social media against their really powerful abusers, if those abusers were able to just sue the companies into oblivion, then those companies are almost certainly going to remove accusations against people the second they're posted. And you're not going to see the development of sort of these movements of the oppressed against the oppressor that we've gotten to see in the last 5, 6, 7 years. Along with this argument about moderation, I think that the negative can pretty persuasively argue that there's already an incentive for companies to make balanced moderation in the status quo. And the reason for that is that it makes a better product, right? People don't want to be on a social media platform or be in a social media company that is purely hosting white supremacist content, because most people aren't white supremacists. Most people aren't terrorists. A really great example of this is going to be Twitter and what happened after Elon Musk took it over. When Elon Musk took over Twitter, he said, we're going to reform moderation. We're going to get all these banned accounts back. We're not going to censor people for their speech. And the result of that is that a lot of advertisers suddenly had their ads appearing next to white supremacist content or really dangerous content. That's not good for advertisers. You've seen millions, tens of millions of dollars worth of advertisers pull out of Twitter in the last couple of months. And so it's hurt the company because they don't moderate. And so I think we can say that right now we're in a good place where companies do balanced moderation, but they're not censoring people. A third possible negative argument here has to do with an alternative. And that's that we already have a precedent in the status quo for making targeted carve-outs to Section 230 rather than a straight repeal. In 2018, Congress passed a set of laws called FOSTA and SESTA that dealt with sex trafficking and abuse of children. And part of what those laws did was say nothing in Section 230 should be used to prevent the prosecution of companies for like aiding and abetting these like sex crimes and human trafficking. And so because we have a precedent to prevent to do these targeted carve-outs, I think the negative can argue that that's better in any circumstance, right? If we just do a targeted carve-out for whatever horrific scenario the affirmative is talking about, that solves their impact without whatever negative impacts a straight repeal brings. Teams will have to be careful with this because in public forum, you can't do a counter plan, but as a generalized alternative, I think this works really well, especially because we have the precedent on this. We've already done it before. All right. And I think that's pretty much it for the basics of this topic. Like I said, this is a really interesting topic. My name is Thadeus Smith. I'm with Champion Briefs. If you liked this topic analysis, please check out the Champion Brief. It's going to have hundreds of pages of evidence on just about every argument you can think of for this topic, arguments that we've talked about in this video, and so many more. Good luck in your tournaments in January, and take care.